Hello, my name is Lisa Walter. On behalf of Bloor Street United Church, welcome to this video of the Living in Transformational Change event held January 15th at Emmanuel College in Toronto. Wrestling with our own particular changing circumstances, our communities and challenges, we know we are not alone, and we believe we are strengthened and inspired by the example and good company of others. So we gather in all the different ways we can, in person, on Zoom during the event, and after the fact by recorded video. We acknowledge the sacred land on which Emmanuel College and the University of Toronto operate, land that has been a site for human activity for many thousands of years, and is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Kitsune First Nations, the Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit River. Settlement and colonialism fostered violence and cultural genocide with the First Peoples and destruction to the sacred land. We commit to listen, learn, and work for justice and reconciliation.
Hello, my name is Heran Kim Craig. I'm the principal at Emmanuel College. On behalf of Emmanuel College, welcome. Today, technology allows us to gather electronically from all over the continent. The towers and buildings that allow this to happen are on some territories that are sites of conflict and struggle. Others included in modern land claim settlements, and many on territory covered by treaties. As we come together, we commit to listen, learn, and work to end dispossession, and for justice and reconciliation. We are delighted to have our wonderful speakers for this event today. Michael Blair, General Secretary of the United Church of Canada, Mary Rowe, the CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, and Rob Dalgleish, the former head of EDGE, a United Church Network for Innovation, will be moderating the session. Thank you.
Michael and Mary, you both bring rich experience to this question within the church and within Bloor Street United. It's in its own transformational change and property redevelopment for context for folks. Mary, from more outside the church, both perspectives very relevant to the conversation today. So I'm going to begin with some really broad framing questions to give Mary and Michael a chance just to respond in ways that seem good to them. We're hoping for a conversational tone, so feel free to engage each other, and I will no doubt be unable to restrain myself from engaging in the conversation as well. So let's start. Everyone here understands the need for change, I'm guessing. You probably struggled with it, either resisting it. Let's face it, we've all done it, even as we've tried to make it happen. And also you probably had that experience of how will this ever move forward? Wheel spinning, car in the rut kind of experience. So I'd like to start with each of you, Michael and Mary, with a kind of a positive thing, just to show it can happen. Where have you experienced transformational change? What does it look like? What have you learned? How were you a part of that, or where have you seen it? And Mary, maybe we'll start with you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm an outlier, but I am a PK. Does that help? But the P was an Anglican P, and but I was raised in the church, and I have a long history of ambivalence about my faith journey and my own faith experience. I see all my United Church brethren nodding. But I did ask for some permission if I can show a few images, because I want to talk about the communities that I've been in and also what I think the context is. So Vanna, when you're ready to put my slides up, go for it, and we'll go very quickly through them. But I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, I'm here, I think, in my secular capacity. I run the Canadian Urban Institute. But as I said, I was raised in the church. I just buried my uncle. He is the son of an archdeacon. Long history, so I have some cred. I think that faith at communities are a bellwether for a lot of what's happening in larger society. And I think we're going through extraordinary change. I think we were going through it before the pandemic, but the pandemic just accelerated it. And so I'm going to breeze you very quickly through some stories that I want to share and then see where we end up in our provocation together. So I run the Urban Institute. Next slide, Vanna. Just you can really go quickly. But you know, Canada is the most urban country in the world. More people live in cities than not live in cities. And the economy, next slide, is driven in cities, where most of you are. But this to me is an interesting piece that I can only show to audiences of faith, which is that our ambivalence towards cities is rooted in Christian tradition. And I don't get to show this slide very often because secular people don't care, but I think we should, because you can see that on the left-hand side are all these things we've inherited about cities are actually bad and they're a problem and they're sinful and they're a pariah. They suck resources out of the rest of the country. I get this all the time in my secular life. Big bad Toronto sucking all the money out of the place. And then you look at the middle stream. Those are the words we use when we talk about what has to happen in cities. They have to be somehow rebirthed, redeemed, we have to get them back away from their nastiness. And science sort of reinforces this and is continuing to help us though understand that actually cities are generative, just like your communities are. Next slide, Vanna. So thanks, Brad. So I'm teasing you, calling him Vanna. So if you look at the economic future of the country, it's primarily urban, but that doesn't mean that it's at the exclusion of rural. And that in fact, this is an ecosystem, an interconnected ecosystem. Next one, Brad, we're going to really go through them quickly because I don't want to bore people. I also am a fellow here at Shorefast, and Shorefast is a rural focused, local economy focused experiment out of Fogo Island, northeast coast of Newfoundland, founded by an entrepreneur who's now working with us across the country to talk about how do you build economies from the ground up. And I think we're going to, next slide, thanks. We're going to find that economies and communities grow interchangeably. Now, this is not a slide that any Torontonian needs to be reminded of because she was your neighbor. I'm sure she was in Bloor Street many times. And we continue, I think, all of us to appreciate more and more since Jane has died, that in fact, if you don't have an inclusive process, if you don't have ways in which you reach around all the different, including our ancestors, including the Indigenous communities and the newcomers, all of them mix, that this parish has had a long commitment to for decades. We don't actually make community if we don't engage everyone. Keep going. So this is the Shorefast image. They use lichens, they're using a natural ecosystem image. Next slide. The other piece of it for me is, and this is how I got into this work, is about how we enable self-organization. Any living organism is dependent on self-organization, and that's what churches have done. They have enabled self-organization as a place. Next slide. So as we go and we think about connection, that ecosystem of which we're all a part is completely dependent on our capacity to connect. Next slide. So when I start to look at my communities, the communities where I've learned this the hard way, I was in New Orleans after Katrina, and I was there for 4 or 5 years during the rebuilding. An extraordinary event, an engineering failure, natural occurring hurricane, levees fail. It wasn't the hurricane that caused the damage. It was the failure of engineering systems, with all due respect to the engineers in the room. But I took this picture. You can see it's maybe 2007, 6, because you can still see there's debris on the road there. That all flooded. That was an entrepreneurial space with a restaurant behind us. And the owners of that entrepreneurial space, when everybody was arriving around the world to tell them how to rebuild, said, wait a second. And I always put this slide up just to remind us that people's attachment to place is profound, because we're still here, you bastards. Next slide. So when you think of the kinds of things that our spaces incubate, serendipity is an incredibly important one. Next one. And this was me on a napkin in a coffee shop in New Orleans, watching how the community was reorganizing itself. It was like the sod had been taken back from the lawn, and you could see how the organic material was reorganizing. And I came to this really beautiful, stunning conclusion that this is what community is about. It's about hubs, and then it's about links that connect us with each other. And I think you are poised at a time when you've got to think about both. Next slide. So, and in my day job, we started focusing on placemaking and what placemaking needs to mean. Next one. And we we decided that we had to find some unit of organization to focus on, otherwise it's overwhelming. Next. So we talked, what's the spine? Well, the spine of any community is a main street. If you're a community of 5,000, 2,000, or 2.5 million, you are organized around main streets. And there are 5 components to a main street. And you'll see right in the center, strong community anchor, which is what a faith institution has been historically. And the great challenge, next slide, is what's going to happen as you go forward. Because we all know, does anybody know where this is? I see AJ Finley is in Zoom, so she'll know. But anybody else recognize this? This is Metropolitan United in London, my hometown. Next slide. And these are extraordinary amenities that exist along main streets across the country. This is a program that we run called My Main Street on DeLong. Next slide, please. But this is what main streets look like at the moment. Pretty much right across the country. This is St. Catherine. Can you stand it? And you'll see there's a church there. But next slide. So the dilemma that we've got is this kind of typology exists in almost every city in the country and community in the country at different scales. Not everybody has an LRT or a streetcar going through it, but that unit exists, and inevitably somewhere in that slice is a faith place. Next slide. When I was in New Orleans, this is Father Luke, the Vietnamese community in New Orleans East. That community was the building block of the recovery of New Orleans East. Next slide, please. This is Denise Thornton. She founded something called Beacons of Hope. Where did she put them? In the churches. She wasn't a religious person. Went to the churches, put those community centers into those facilities. Next slide, we're almost at the end. So we came up with the strategies at the Urban Institute about what we have to do to actually recover our main streets and downtowns. And you'll see this, the first slide or somewhere is one of them anyway, talks about how are we going to strengthen local leadership. It's all about the economy, but it's also about social cohesion and public safety. And this has to happen at a remarkable scale at the granular level across the country. Next slide, almost to the end. So this is a quote that I actually stole, which I think you need to adopt. So much of our lives is segmented. Where we are with people with so much, we are so much like ourselves, but the dynamism of cities is that ideas and cultural manifestations come out of connections of people of different backgrounds. That's what happens within. It needs to be faith institutions. What was there was libraries, but it needs to be faith institutions as well. Next slide. So you probably know these folks. They're on the other side. They're the Anglicans. Graham Singh, I think, is probably in the Zoom audience. I stole some of his slides. Thank you, Graham. Next slide. He's trying to make the case with partners across the country. We've got 12,000 Christian congregations that own real estate. In that 9-year period from 09 to 18, almost 20% of them closed. He's got a very, you probably have one as well, a very bleak statistic about what the next 8 years looks like in terms of church reallocations. And Graham's number is that 3,250 land owning congregations are in multi-year deficits and less than 3 years of cash reserves. So the next 8 years is telling. Next one. That's right. Go ahead. Next one. Go ahead. So he's got this sort of grid here to suggest where are the gaps in the system that need to be filled. And his foundation and his partners and an impact fund are trying to create what the key interventions are. Next slide. Thanks. I put this up as my last slide because, do you know what this is actually? This is my backyard skating rink when I'm a kid. That's me, 3 from the right. All of us, that we all lived on the street. My sister's second from the left. AJ will be smiling, AJ Finley, because she will recognize the people in the slide because she was the wife of the minister of the church that we lived on a street in London. We all went to the same church. We all had an experience of our neighborhood and of our faith that was completely intertwined. Our sense of obligation to one another, our sense of community celebration, our sense of belonging. You can stop the slides. So what I would say is that there's a lot at stake here in terms of the spaces that you have stewarded and we in the faith community have stewarded for a century or more and how they transform. And if we don't get in front of this, the development community will. and are. And then the market will push us into a place that basically allows virtually one kind of housing and one kind of development. And that is not what the history of these places has been, or the way in which that ecosystem has evolved, which is dependent on many, many more mixed uses and those places where you interact with people that are different from yourself. And if we allow that to happen on our watch and just let high-end condos become the default, then shame on us. And we have got to figure out what are the right conditions to convince all of us to repurpose these spaces in creative and imaginative ways, to continue to be anchors in their communities, on their streets, and to reimagine what our ministry then needs to look like in a secular society with all the challenges that we're up against, climate, social justice, all of it. And I think it's a moment that we can't lose. And I think after COVID, it's kind of the time.
Thanks, Mary. Just a follow-up if I can, because you mentioned the centrality of connection, and also this idea that the church has what society needs.
Right.
The relevance is not the issue.
Right.
And yet from the inside, it can feel like there is this gap between the church and society. And in fact, that picture of the church, the big oak door closed, I wonder how to get through it. And I wonder, because you've kind of named yourself as relevant, but somewhat on the outside, what does that gap look like? And what is the way through that? Like how do we get through to that place of connection? What's in the way?
We're so self-referential in the church, right? We just talk to each other. I mean, Michael should comment on this. He's stewarding it in a much bigger way than me. I think one of the things we talked about just standing before we got going is what would happen if government removed the tax treatment of faith institutions? What would happen then to your forward planning and to your engagement with your community, if in fact you were compelled into that place? New Orleans was compelled into, as you say, they didn't have the Dutch. They were compelled into a different kind of environmental stewardship because they didn't have much choice. Their survival was completely at odds if they didn't. And the pandemic has done a similar kind of thing, I hope, to compel us into a new kind of understanding. So I would like us to just, if we could stop looking in the mirror, wondering if we're as beautiful as we think we should be, and just forget that, and just open those doors and figure out what do we need to be, what do we need to evolve to be with our neighbors. I don't know. You guys have to tell me whether we can get over ourselves as church people, and be more community people with our values intact. What do you think? You worked in congregations all the time. So.
Yeah, well, I think your challenge is right on, that we need to get over ourselves and get connected.
We also can't afford it. You can't afford it, right? We're all going broke. In the Anglican world, just looking to my Anglicans any Anglicans there who can nod on the Zoom, we're all going broke. We can't afford these places if we don't find new partners.
I was grateful for the reference to New Orleans and the gift of the crisis. It reminded me of a think tank years ago at the General Council office around how we fund new ministry in the United Church. And there was a vice president of the Royal Bank of Canada there who said, stood up at one point and said, I was so disappointed when you got this big inheritance. There was a big legacy that was left at that time, because she said, because I thought the reconciliation costs would push you to a moment of transformational change. She said, I would not lend you my money at this point because you don't believe in what you do.
Wow.
If you did, you would use the resources that you have to solve your own question.
Wow.
So if you don't believe in what you do, why should I believe in what you do and give you my money to do it?
Wow.
Yeah, it was a very prophetic statement.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
How do you follow that? It's good to be here, and it's good to be at space with Mary. Mary and I have lots of history from my time in Regent Park, and I think Mary has kind of moved us into some of the critical issue, but just to start back and reflect a little bit about the question of transformation. I think I want to pick up on this question of the fact that I would say two things. One of the challenges that faces us in the context of the church is that we forget that our very existence is about those outside of the walls of the church. That so often our attentiveness is to our own particular context within the box, we don't think. And I'll use an illustration. When we were in Regent Park, and recognizing that the transformation that was going to happen in Regent Park, in particular in the first phase of the work in Regent Park, that they were going to be moving people who had lived in their own homes for 20, 30, 40 years. And that one of the challenge with that, as we know, that move-in is a stressful situation. Because we were connected to the community, and I think that's the other piece, because we were connected to the community, we recognized that we needed to attend to the challenges of people who were going to be moving, who might experience or would experience trauma. So knowing the community, having a sense, recognizing that the city, the housing corporation, everybody in the community were attending to the physical challenge of the redevelopment in Regent Park. There was nobody who was attending to the both the social and kind of spiritual needs of people in the community. So we came up with the idea of having a community chaplain who would just be a presence in the community, working with folks who were being moved. Just to jump ahead and then come back, one of the things that happened was that within the first 6 months of people being relocated, six of the folks died. And we knew that kind of trauma would happen. And in fact, we had the chaplain in place, and he was asked by the housing company to provide memorial services and build a connection with people in the community. But when we came to the church with the idea of putting in place a community chaplain, we were told no, they would not fund it, that there was no resources. And in fact, at the time we were told we were double dipping because we were getting resources from the church for the work of the CRC at the time. And so I was trying to figure out how I'm going to fund this thing because it was a critical. The housing company, within a week of the housing company starting to work with helping people identify where they were going to be relocated to, the housing company came back to me and said, that idea you had for a community chaplain, do you still need money? And so for about 5 years, the housing company funded the position. And in fact, I've heard the housing company say it was the first time in its history that it relocated that many people in any part of the world that happened as smoothly as it did. And one of the things they point to that helped with that smoothness was the presence of a community chaplain. So sometimes when we're not connected to the community and don't understand what the needs of the community are, then we focus on ourselves, and the possibility or transformation that can happen doesn't happen. I mean, I must confess, this guy we hired was the wackiest person you could ever think. Absolutely. I mean, he was wacky. But it worked. And you know, one of the things he did, he had his camera and he would go around taking pictures of people. And that sparked a whole host of conversation and community building and confidence. So it's a transformation for me is about connecting to the place we are in. Too many of our experiences that we don't know what is happening in the context of the community. I think, historically, the gift of the automobile changed the landscape, at least for many of us, from parish to a place of location. So, we travel. I travel. Bloor Street is my congregation, but I travel past a number of United Church to go to Bloor Street every Sunday morning. And I go into Bloor Street when we were here, but even where we are now, well, I used to pastor in that neighborhood where St. Matthew's is, so I have a bit of a sense of it. But I can confess, I knew nothing about the community. I went in for worship and I left with no connection to community. So I think the places where I've experienced transformation is the places where there has been a connection to community, and relationships in those community were able to thrive, and we could see a change happen where people would value the presence of the church. So some of you know, and it's not too far from here, I pastored Wilmer Road Baptist Church a number of years ago, and we did an experiment once. We stood in front of the church, and as people were coming home into the neighborhood, we would ask if they knew where Wilmer Road Baptist Church was. Nobody knew. We were right in front of the bloody thing. Right? It said something about our irrelevance in that community. So I think this notion of connected to place is a critical one. The second thing I would say, and it's leadership. I think we, in the context of where we find ourselves these days, we lack leadership, and particularly for those of us in the United Church. I say it as the General Secretary, and I know it's going to bite me tomorrow, but I'll say this now, is that we have a system that beats down any kind of leadership. And the reality is the places where transformation happen are the places where people lead. And I think it is critical, and certainly in my role as General Secretary, I'm committed to leading, right? And part of that leadership for me is not about my sense of self, but part of me is about recognizing clarity about what needs to happen. And we've gone through a process in the church that helps to make that clear, but clarity about what needs to happen. And in that clarity is to invite people to see the possibility. Mary just showed us some slides. How do we help people see what they can't see? Right? Because that's the problem. We cannot see. I was in a conversation with for an article in Broadview, and the question that came was a little bit surprising. And one of the things the person asked was why it was that the United Church, given the work on anti-racism and intercultural church, why it is that the United Church of Canada is the most white church in the country. Of all denominations, the United Church of Canada is the whitest of all the churches, and our attraction of people from other racial ethnic background is pretty limited. And there was a part of me that kind of smirked at the question initially, because in some ways there's a historical context for that being the reality of what we are as a church. But beyond that is the fact that we have not stood up and understood our context and figured out how it is that we actually become the United Church of Canada, that as it exists today, as Canada exists today, not the United Church of Canada that existed in 1925. But you can only have change if you're willing to lead and to make a hard decision. And part of that leadership requires a willingness to engage with people who are different from who you are. And to Mary's point, I think part of our challenge is that we love talking to ourselves, and we love hearing ourselves talk to ourselves, and we love hearing ourselves affirmed because we don't talk to those who can help us see what we can't see. Right? And I think it's critical to be able to. So, I have a mentor, and the mentor is working with me to engage in conversation with some significant leaders from, the public sector, from the private sector, just to sit down and have them help me understand how to give leadership in this particular time in the context in which we find ourselves. And I think that's critical. Leadership is critical. Connection to community is critical as part of this transformation. I'll stop there.
But I want to ask a question, because you've challenged us around leadership, because what I'm hearing, though, is many of the conversations that have energy and even in churches are, but what hymns will we sing, or what music will we have, or should we have pews, or if we do let people into the building, how do we make sure this is still church? What would you say? What would you say to those people struggling with those questions?
So a couple of things for me. One is my imagination over the last year or so has been drawn to a text from Isaiah 58, which begins by, there's this challenge that God have with the people of Israel. And it's about their kind of narcissism in some ways around their form of worship. And they're priding themselves in terms of how they worship. The reality is that, prophet says, but, what is God expecting, right? How you care for those who are marginalized. That part of our responsibility is rebuilding the foundations that have been broken. Part of it is building streets. And I love this image in verse 12 of 58, that we're repairers of the breach, restorers of streets to live in. Right? Mm-hmm. That's the city thing, right? That's what we're about. And I think in some ways to just get back to my point, I think there are two things. Lack of leadership to challenge in the kind of debates we have in the church, and a lack of, I want to call it vision, but a lack of understanding about what it means to be the church of Jesus Christ, right? That part of that being the church is about our call to engage, right? To restore the breach, to repair the breach, repair that which is broken, right? That's part of our ministry, to repair that which is broken, to restore foundations, right? And you think about that in terms of what does that mean in terms of the context in which lack of community, lack of connection, right? Those foundations have been broken down, and the gift we have is an understanding, right or wrong, about what community can look like. We probably need to be stretched around our understanding of community. This whole notion of restorers of city to live, streets to live on, right? The image, whenever I think of that text, I Mary ended with the picture. I think about growing up in Jamaica and what happened, the sense of what happened in our neighborhood. We were well off, we're the first people on our street to get a television set. And so as soon as in Jamaica at that time when I was a kid, which was many moons ago, there's only one television station, right? But our yard and our television was set up so that people could watch through the window. Our yard was full of people watching television in our neighborhood, and the relationships. Some of you know my other name is Peter. And I'm always amazed when I hear somebody call me Peter, because it's always, apart from family members, are people from those days that are here in the city who encounter me, right? And there's a safety and a warmth and a sense that came from that, a street to live on, community, connections, hope, security, all that kind of stuff. And I think I just wish we could just begin to understand that, and then begin to think about what it is that we're called to do. How is it that we, as the people of God, in whatever formation we find ourselves, think about those tasks of repairing the beach, restoring foundation, and building streets, cities to live in?
There are all of these pieces of the context. Me too. Reconciliation with Indigenous people, climate crisis, anti-colonial, anti-racism work. So there's a lot kind of going on in this time. What do you think we need to be aware of in the context as we struggle with this question of transformative change?
So your question is just exhausting. I want you to shut this down. I think that would be my serious challenge here. I think you're making it too complicated. Maybe it's a good United Church trait that you have to curb. But and listen, I'm a United Church wannabe, like Anglicans all are. We all want to be as progressive as you are, and we want to be as on top of all these issues, as Rob just demonstrated. But I think you need to make this much simpler. A chaplain in a community, you find a crazy guy. Every community has a few crazy guys. They may or may not be called the chaplain. We all know them. Think about your neighborhood. There's a crazy guy, there's a crazy gal. She's the one, or he's the one, or they're the one that kind of keeps tabs on people, takes things around, observes something, takes a photograph, makes a connection. Communities, if we get them at the smallest scale we can, those people are there. Could you challenge yourself? I know that, listen, I was raised in the church, and all that belly aching we did when I was a teens and 20s about what's the future of the church, and where are the believers and all that. What would happen if we let that all go? We let that be God's. And let's focus on the place. Let's focus on one of your great assets, which is that you've been located in a place for a long period of time. And you're a landmark, and people know, even they didn't know where Walmer was, but they knew there was a church there. And you've got an asset. And in this market, frankly, the fact that you have an asset is extraordinary. Whether you own it or you rent it, you do have a physical place. So what would happen if you let go of all that burden of responsibility that you just recited and say, we're going to work from our place that gathers people that we know people need. People need these kinds of places. That's why we all go out for coffee. I'm old enough to remember you never went out for coffee. Now we all go out for coffee. We go and we sit in a coffee shop. There was no coffee shop when I was a kid. There was, I don't know where my parents had coffee. They had it at their kitchen table. But now everybody goes to these places. So, and we need more of them. And even with us all being on Zoom, everybody still goes to a place. So what would happen if you made it much simpler? And you said, for the next decade, we're going to focus on what is the future of this place? What are the relationships we need? What's the capital we need to accumulate with our partners? And what can we co-create with a whole bunch of different folks around this place? And then find our faith there.
And I would say the other thing is we need new language.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I struggle with our language about closing churches.
Yeah.
Because language has a way of kind of shaping reality. And for the simple reason that when we talk about closing churches, we abandon our responsibility to community and neighborhood.
Right.
And so I think we need new language to talk about what happened. So, the reality for many of us is that we're getting to the place where we can't afford buildings, and it's a conversation we need to have around what we do with that. But buildings is not what it means to be church. So the question that I'm kind of wrestling with is part of that, the call that we've developed around bold discipleship. Question is, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus in this time and this place? And so if we can imagine the fact that we may only be 10 or 15, we can't afford the property, and we have to make decisions about the property. But we're still disciples of Jesus who needs to figure out what it means to be disciples in the context where we are. What happens is that we close buildings, we close the community, folks, and this is partly, 50 or 60% of the people who attend just drop out of church entirely. And there's no way of the kind of connecting that needs to happen. And there's no sense of what is lost in this neighborhood because somehow we distract ourselves. I often think about the question around Abraham and the three visitors around Sodom, right? Sometimes I wish Abraham had gone as low as one. he chickened out. But part of it for me is this notion that the presence of a few makes a difference, and God is willing not to bring judgment because of the presence of a few. And so we need to get back to a sense of what it means to be church is to be followers, disciples of Jesus, connected to a place and time, and that we have some responsibility to that place at the particular time in which we find ourselves.
So can I just push back a little bit on this? I want to know why it's your decision. Why is it your decision to close or not close? Why is it only your decision?
Good question.
You've derived a public benefit by not paying taxes for a long time. So presumably there's a broader public input into what the future is. And why should the burden only sit with the 15 or the 20 or the 25 families that can't pay for it anymore? I have a concern about the obligation there, but I also have a concern about, I guess I would push back a little bit on this. I actually think the place itself is critical. And that I would say that even though you don't have them worshiping with you or they don't show up, there'd be all sorts of people in that community that have a vested interest in the landmark or the place or where the kids play floor hockey or where they go to vote or whatever the heck it is, that whether we've got the right tools to engage that broader constituency and what should the future of this place be. So as a secular person, I'm concerned about us losing these places. I'm concerned about neighborhoods becoming only commercial, only dominated by business interests, or only dominated by high-end condo housing. And we're really diminishing the resilience of those neighborhoods because they become monocultures, and monocultures do not last in any environment. They don't last in nature, they don't last in economics, and they do not last in neighborhoods. So I don't want to lose your space. And what I don't know is how we can get faith communities to be porous enough to share the decision-making and to be brave enough to be able to cope with an outcome that might not make everybody happy. What would happen if we said to ourselves, this, blue sky ideas, that all church properties should become land trusts, that there's some mechanism where there's some kind of publicly held entity that has to take the liability and the asset. And that you're engaged in that process, and as are all your neighbors and stakeholders. And because I am concerned about us losing these public spaces only to certain kinds of uses, and then the market just swoops in, and you've all experienced it, and with all due respect, it looks to me like that's what's happened with Bloor Street. The market has dictated your redevelopment, and that's a shame. I'm sure it was not without challenge, but I worry about that, right? And I'm sure there are examples across the country that we should be trying to figure out, why was it possible here, not possible there. I'm not saying housing is always the answer, but I am concerned about diversity of use and civic use. Where are we going to vote? Fundamental. I guess we're all going to vote online. We're not going to bother going anywhere. Well, that, that's not going to happen, right? So we've got to have these spaces, and you guys should be helping figure that out with us.
This is helpful, right? But because, and again, back to the question of leadership, that within our context, within the context of United Church, somebody's have to start pushing us in that direction, right?
And you're not the only ones, good God.
No.
Let's just be clear.
Yeah, I mean, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Lutherans,
Roman
everybody,
Catholics.
yeah, everybody is finding that. So again, part of it is the vehicle. Part of it is, I think, the sense that we are so invested in a way that it's ours.
Right, I know.
That to break that is a huge challenge.
Yeah, and the only entity in the market that says, oh, I can take it off your hands, is a certain scale of developer with a certain deep pocket of capital behind them.
Yeah. And I wonder if, because of the ways in which we think about it, collectively, we have lost our voice to be able to pressure governments. I think about when we were in Regent Park around the housing development.
Yeah.
The wonderings about why is it so, just so you know, that there was a decision made to try and help residents of Regent Park move into home ownership. And we started that, I think you probably initiated that conversation about what are the other options, because the value of home ownership was seen as the success.
Yeah.
And so the other opportunity to think about other forms of housing never quite happened. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So even that question about expectations around our sort of economic futures becomes part of the conversation that needs to happen.
And there's also a complication that congregations in the United Church do not tend to be locally populated.
Right.
So the question of place is not as simple as that.
Right.
So part of that has to do with leadership. And I also want to push back a little bit, a couple of things that you said, because I'm starting to see the value of this perspective from outside the church to inside the church. So congregations have been benefiting from tax benefits for a long time. So there should be this responsiveness to that. But there is this business of engagement and disconnection between people outside the church and inside the church. So what kind of leadership do we need to bring to this?
Well, I want to just remind you that you're not the only ones going through this. Think of your neighborhood. Think of how underused the school is. It's a block from you. Think of that big parking lot. Think of the fact that schools don't function 24/7, which is ridiculous. Think of how difficult it is to have that conversation. Who would you have it with? The principal, powerless. The superintendent, powerless. The trustee, unbelievably small, political. You're not the only ones going through this. So I think what we need are some really great, fabulous examples where there's a risk tolerance and they've tried something. And then, you know, what happens is people say, oh, look at the Halifax Public Library, it's glorious. Or look at, you know, something, they get away with it. They operate under the radar, they create something fantastic, and then all of us say, oh, what? So I think we need to be engaging the design community. I think there are lots of smart architects, engineers, artists, visual designers who, if let loose, would come up with a gazillion fabulous, appealing stuff we've never thought of. And there's tons of them in the Indigenous community. There are some terrific Indigenous designers. And so I think that would be interesting. Do some provocations, get those folks who may not be sitting in the pew with you or in the chair with you, but are around to help us imagine things. And I like it being concrete, you know, I like us physically seeing something. I think it does provoke thoughts. So that would be one. I think that's where some leadership can come from.
Often leadership is thought of as sustaining order, having clarity, providing answers. Leaders are expected. That's kind of an old mindset. Others more recently, in terms of adaptive thinking, would say the job of the leader is to keep things in the zone of productive disequilibrium.
Clarity doesn't necessarily mean you restore order, at least not my understanding of it. Clarity is about clarity of purpose, right? And I think in some ways, leadership that understands that it needs resources so that it's bringing people to the table. I think part of the kind of leadership we need is a leadership that understands purpose and understands a process of working towards that purpose, which is bringing people together. You know, one of the things that working with Mary back in Regent Park was just recognizing, you know, my experience in Regent Park made me think about my experience in congregational ministry before that, right? Because one of the things I learned, which is it kind of shaped me coming out of those days, is the importance of connecting with people who have some sense of what's going on. So, you know, I remember as a congregational minister, I mean, I had no connection with who my municipal leaders, the person who served my area as a municipal leader, had no clue. I mean, I know their name. I never sat down with them for coffee or anything to kind of say, so what's going on in this neighborhood? What can you tell me that is helpful to ministry? No connection with the MPP in terms of, again, you know, from a government perspective, what's going on? What are they thinking? What are they hearing from their constituencies in this community? No connection with federal folks. None of that, right? But once we started, and Mary, you can tell the story. I'll cue. So there were six of us. There were six of us in Regent Park who, as clergy, started to get together to say, we need to figure out how we're going to engage all the stuff that was going on in Regent Park, you know, because it was out of our comfort zone. We know how to do the clergy stuff. We don't know how to engage in this kind of space. And so we connected with Mary's predecessor. And we went and met and said, look, we're clergy. We don't know where to begin. We spent hours with him. I mean, he offered to give us a couple of hours. I think we ended up spending half the day. What we didn't know was that he was part of the mayor's group on the City of Toronto Act, right? And out of our conversation with him, he went back to that meeting and he said, You know who's missing from the table? You remember that? Absolutely. Right. So out of that connection, there was a recognition that the faith groups were not part of the conversation that was happening around the City of Toronto Act, which happened, right? But I mean, we didn't know what we were doing. Part of our leadership was find some people who can help us think about how we might engage. And that conversation became generative in a whole host of other ways. That you were in the meeting, so you could. So I think part of it's a leadership that clear about purpose, but knows that it needs connection, right? And it's not just when we're in trouble. And that's part of the problem, right? Because by the time we're in trouble, we don't have sufficient relationship. And one of the ideas that came out of that conversation was, what if we let go of our denominational tribal connection and began to ask the question, what does a Christian presence mean in these communities? Right? And that's a conversation that we're trying to nurture to kind of figure that out together. And to me, that's leadership, right? It's about bringing people together to help you imagine what could be possible, rather than simply, trying to fix things. I mean, God knows, I can't fix the United Church, but what I can do is make sure people are working with me are smarter than I am.
So Edge has been posturing social innovation as a means of viable mission in the church. Actually, we've been fostering it. We've been noticing it and supporting it. And there are people in this room that are part of that movement. But that is a big kind of internalized mindset that resists that idea that God would be working through the BIA or a social enterprise, or God forbid if it was a for-profit organization. The Kindred Works, which is the United Church's version of how do we support congregations that are doing need to do property redevelopment for new forms of mission, they're a for-profit organization because the restrictions imposed by a colonial view of philanthropy and charity make a charitable organization a difficult structure to actually carry out what needs to be done. But there's still this suspicion, particularly I think in the United Church, because of our suspicion of current oppressive forms of economic capitalism.
So probably I'd come at it a little bit circular, in the sense that there's no doubt that one of the things that we have to think about these days is how we fund the work. I think the reality of ministry being funded solely on the basis of people who, I'm going to use the term pew, but it's you understand, where it's funded solely from the pews or rentals, need some reimagination. So I think there is, social enterprise is one of the ways we may come at that. And we need to kind of think about what that looked like. But I think the larger question for me is, how do we reimagine ways of funding the work that allows us both the capacity and the possibility of finding the resources we need? And we cannot, for peace sake, do that on the backs of diasporic communities who rent our property. Enough said.
And I just I don't know your world, and I appreciate how you're sharing it with me and being patient with me as I try to understand it. But what I would say is that I think that the enemy here is the accumulation of capital, and what happens when that gets concentrated in very few hands. And I'm afraid that almost everybody here, judging from the age range I'm looking at, most of you are benefiting from that because you have a pension of some description. That's the real nub that we have in Canada. We have pension funds accumulating and making more and allowing you the standard of life that you worked for. But that's a big dilemma because that money is held and concentrated and not accessible. And I think that's a big challenge. And I hope the United Church will take on the theological notion of that. And how do we break that up? It's a Gordian knot. I would hope you're not really demonizing as somebody who is running a for-profit coffee shop and trying to keep 3 people employed, paying just above minimum wage around the corner from you. That is capitalism, and I hope that's not the enemy in your mind, because I think that 2/3 of the Canadian population are employed in a small or medium enterprise, and I think that for the most part, they're honest, hardworking, good efforts, and we shouldn't be doing anything to judge them, in my view. So I think it's creative, and I think it's dynamic, and I think it's what keeps us going. I agree with Michael that we need to be really imaginative about how do we reallocate resources in ways that strengthen communities, public resources, private resources, philanthropy, the mix. And in other environments, in other economies, there are more vehicles. And that's part of what you were trying to do with the Edge and with Kindred. It's part of what Graham Singh's trying to do with Trinity. It's part of what the cooperative movement has historically done for years in Canada, and through credit unions and co-ops. And I think we need more and more and more of those models. So I'm back to, let's create some new ways, some new models. Let's try some stuff. Let's see if we can up our risk tolerance in small ways to try some stuff and see if that's a way to do it. And that may involve a mixed economy. In Quebec, there are lots of interesting churches that have a mix of a for-profit and a social enterprise and a this and a restaurant. And you guys probably know that church that has that beautiful restaurant. It's a high-end restaurant. It was owned by the sisters. It's also got, a daycare at the back. Like those kinds of models are where we're going. And I hope we can all look at it in an open mind.
But it's hard for the imagination of the church to say that is church, as much as sitting in pews on Sunday morning listening to a preacher elucidate the gospel text.
Yeah, and just I would say maybe that's even a place where we change language. That there's a certain connection or a notion about what church means. And in some ways, in a naive way, I'm saying, part of me is saying, let's change the language to about discipleships. People are coming together to be faithful to what the sense of following Jesus means.
Hello again. I like to call the types of questions that were discussed today, how then shall we live? Question. We hope that you have enjoyed watching and listening to portions of the conversation, and we hope that the ideas and rumblings that have begun for you are carried forward to many places, to other gatherings and other contexts. I want to acknowledge and appreciate Emmanuel staff that have helped us with this event. Michelle Voss-Roberts and Wanda Chin, Sean Houston, and Gopi from Vic University for the tech help. And the Bloor Street staff, Amanda Christie, Susan Jennings, and Wendy Goodwin, and congregational helpers Martha and Emma. On behalf of everyone who joined in, I thank these folks: Hiram Kim Craig, Brad Antle, who hosted the Zoom meeting, which was recorded, Mary Rowe, Michael Blair, and Rob Dalgleish. Your gift of time and talent truly are treasured. This conversation is the second piece of the adaptive conversation for Bloor Street congregation, and there are more kinds of conversation circles coming up. One of these, the midweek Midrash gatherings, are open to everyone everywhere through Zoom. You can find the link to that or check in on our congregation's adaptive process through our website, bloorstreetunited.org, our Facebook page, or our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching this video. God be with you till we meet again.